Africans, Caribbeans, Latino Americans, or Afro-Latinos continue to experience racial discrimination and oppression, and Africans on the continent are experiencing xenophobia and nativism. And both these approaches, Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, have provided hope and help in the past, and both of them date back to the 19th century. However, these two schools of thought have dissipated as advancements have been made in the United States in terms of civil rights acts, both in 1866 and 1960s, and as colonialism has ended in Africa. However, racism, as we know, still exists, and xenophobia and nativism still plague the Black world. And so the goal of my paper was to look at these two approaches, to look at the origins of both approaches, and to see whether these key tenets of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism can manifest in the 21st century to aid the Black world. And so I look at the origins of Black nationalism, which, for those of you who may not know, Black nationalism, or the rise of consciousness of Black people that they were oppressed simply because of their skin color or their race, can be traced back to 19th century America. And so this rise in consciousness ushered in a desire for Black people to unify in order to combat some of the suffering that they faced in the United States. And David Walker wrote a piece titled "Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World," which was published back in September of 1829. And it's considered one of the first pieces of literature that contained Black nationalist sentiment. And in it, he called for an immediate end to slavery. He accused his fellow Christians who were Caucasian of hypocrisy for engaging in the institution of slavery. He called for land reparations. He wanted this desire of people of African descent to govern themselves in America. He wanted to, in his work, instill racial pride. And he also criticized American capitalism. And so this piece kind of ushered in the first Black nationalist movement. And the movement began around 1850 and it culminated in 1861. And in order to, at that time, to preserve the Union, the compromise in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act were passed, whereby you had these federal agents who were capturing and returning people who they believed to be runaway slaves to their slave masters. And as a result of the Fugitive Slave Act, you had African Americans who began to unify in an effort to move north with the hopes of making it to either Canada or even England to be relatively safe from this Fugitive Slave Act mandate. And following that, the Dred Scott and Harriet Scott Supreme Court decision, whereby the Supreme Court decided that Black people were never going to be citizens of this country and they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect, also ushered in this movement and this unification of African Americans in this country, and it ultimately converged in what we now call, the fast moving river of Black nationalism. And so while some African Americans then believed leaving America would be the only way to experience true liberation, others believed that you shouldn't have to leave your home and the place that you were born in order to enjoy civil rights and civil liberties. And so the second Black nationalist movement happened after the Civil War and in this Jim Crow era. And there was a new crop of Black nationalist leaders that emerged, and they argued in order to find liberation and success in America, African Americans needed to segregate themselves and create their own opportunities. And so during this time, you had the Great Migration, where African Americans began to leave the South with the hopes of moving north for better opportunities, which wasn't always the case because they ran into issues in the North that prevented them from working in certain areas, living in certain areas. And with the beginning of World War I, that further disrupted the lives of African Americans all over the country. And although we had pockets of communities that did find some financial freedoms and some success, and you had these communities that were growing and flourishing, you still had issues of race riots, racism, burning down of neighborhoods and communities that were thriving simply because they were a threat to what was deemed the status quo at the time. And again, with the beginning of the war, when you had these African Americans enlisted in the military, that again further disrupted their lives. The third Black nationalist movement began after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. While legislation is important, it of course did not change the economic or social conditions of many African Americans. And so at the time, two new organizations emerged, the Black Panther Party and the US organization, which took up the political and cultural baton to advocate for African Americans for political, socioeconomic, and cultural rights. And specifically, the Black Panther Party focused on education, housing, employment, racial justice, and while the US organization emphasized on African American centeredness, embracing the 7 principles of African nation building and Kwanzaa. And both of these organizations, unfortunately, and I'm trying to go pretty quickly here so I can cover as much as I can within the time allotted. Both of these organizations unfortunately faded from national appeal for various reasons. Some because of interference from federal agents and covert missions, and other because of disagreements that happened within their organizations. And now I'm looking at the state of the United States and whether we're in a fourth Black nationalist movement. And perhaps what we're seeing now is a viable Black nationalist movement, which began with the acquittal of that man who killed, and I'm not going to say his name, who killed Trayvon Martin, who was an unarmed teenager, for those of you who may not know, in Florida in 2013. And his death ushered in, or his murder ushered in, this organic grassroots movement, which we now refer to as the Black Lives Matter movement. And my argument is Black nationalism is quite relevant in the 21st century because there has been, in my opinion, this false sense of security in America that one's wealth, their level of education, their pedigree, occupation absolves some Black Americans from the realities of racial disparities and repression and oppression in America. And this movement, be it a Black Lives Matter movement, or as I argue, the fourth Black nationalist movement, has become extremely relevant because it serves to remind all Americans, Black, white, Asian, Latinx, and other, that there's still a long way to go because racism is still very prevalent in the United States and hasn't been overcome, even with the election of a quote unquote African American president. The sentiment that racism still exists in America is also not widely accepted by all Black Americans. Some African Americans believe because of their current socioeconomic status, which afforded them better homes and wealthier neighborhoods, admittance to now unrestricted country clubs, access to the upper echelons of society, that they believe that the civil rights acts and those battles have been fought and won. And this Black Lives Matter movement and everything that we've seen over this past several years has reawakened many people and forced many people, including African Americans, to create these new avenues and spaces for feeling safe in America. And also corporate America, most recently, has realized that they've participated in institutional racism and are now trying to financially support African Americans. And so I'm going to move quickly to look at the origins of Pan-Africanism. Again, it goes back to the 19th century. And Pan-Africanism in this movement sought to uplift unified people of African descent for political, social, and economic empowerment globally. And so the origins of Pan-Africanism began in the 19th century with at the height of colonialism. And so many of these Pan-African leaders took exception to colonialism and advocated for liberation of African countries. And they focused on educating the Western world, to dispel the myths that Black people were worthless and made no significant contributions to humanity. And you have these leaders who ushered in these different conferences over a long period of time to call for an end to colonialism. And as these countries became independent, you have these African leaders who formulated the Organization for African Unity. And the goal of this organization was to discuss these arbitrary borders that were drawn in Africa by its colonial powers that created a lot of conflict, wars and conflict between neighbors, and uneven distribution of resources. And so the argument of these leaders of the OAU was to try to convince these African leaders to forego some of their state sovereignty for the greater good. But unfortunately, some of these leaders did not want to forego their state sovereignty for the greater good. There was a notion to create the United States of Africa as opposed to keeping the continent as it is with all these different countries. The idea was to create a United States of Africa whereby there would be further unification. Quickly about the origins of xenophobia, it could be traced back to the BC era. And xenophobia is just this fear or dislike of people who are different from you from different places. And some African countries are experiencing this reemergence of xenophobic threats from Africans moving into their countries because of scarce resources in their homeland. They're looking for better opportunities. They're looking for employment, better housing, public services. And that's led to this uprising of violence. And what's happening currently in some of these African countries in terms of xenophobia and nativism is the antithesis of the Pan-Africanist movement. And so my argument is Pan-Africanism, again, is still very relevant in the 21st century. And we need to get back to this notion of unification and unity and not treating one another, even if they're of a different country, as foreigners and strangers, and try to find a way to provide enough goods and services and resources and opportunities for individuals so they don't have to migrate to new countries to seek those things out, and to welcome foreigners as neighbors and friends and not threats. And so in conclusion, my argument is that both Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism are very relevant in the 21st century, and there can be lessons gleaned from both and applied to what's happening now here in the United States and on the continent to try to solve and right some of the wrongs and address some of the issues that plague both African Americans and Africans. And I'll stop there as to, not take up too much time. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Saida. And you still had about a minute left. So I appreciate you being mindful of time. Next, we have Victor.
Thank you. Mine will be very, very brief. The title of my paper is Real African Union, Political Stability and Economic Growth, Prospects and Impediments. The focus of this paper picks up on some of what Saida just discussed. I started my paper with a question. Does African Union offer solutions to the challenges facing the continent's economy? Because they all debate about nativism, xenophobia, integration, regionalism, all revolve around the issue of economy. Of course, we understand that wherever resources is scarce, then the authoritative allocation will become political. But it is even more so for African countries because of the very foundation of most of these neo-colonial, post-colonial states. African countries face immense development problems that are evident in their low per capita income, poverty, high debt. The founding fathers of Organization of African Unity envisaged that the neo-colonial states will only continue to satisfy the expectation of the colonialist. So as many states in Africa become independent, the first group of independent countries in Africa came together and discussed the future of African continent. The movement built upon Pan-Africanism that started in Britain and the conference that are being held in many other parts of the world, but outside of African continents. So the founding fathers were confronted with many questions. One is, what do we want for Africa? What do we expect from Africa? And what can Africa be? So my first question is, can this organization resolve African problem? The OAU was created in 1963 after the three regional groups decided to come together and found a United States of Africa. Now, there were three groups. The first group was Casablanca Group. The second group was Brazzaville Group, and the third group was Monrovia Group. The leader of the Casablanca Group was the former president of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. Immediately, Nigeria became independent in 1960. Nigeria, because of the size and population, became the leader of the Monrovia Group. The Brazzaville Group and Monrovia Group share the same philosophical principles. So they merged the two groups together and adopted the name Monrovia Group. So the debate was between the Monrovia Group and the Casablanca Group. So the leader of Monrovia Group was former Nigerian Prime Minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. The Casablanca Group had a vision for United States of Africa. Their belief is that Pan-Africanism gave them the direction for where Africa should go. But Pan-Africanism will continue to be relevant even after all African states have been independent. And they believe that independence is just the beginning, that for Africa as a continent to thrive, all African states will have to unite. To do this, they will have to abandon the colonial boundaries and form a united continent. So Kwame Nkrumah insisted that the way forward was to have a United States of Africa, like the United States of America, so that the continent can harness its resources, irrespective of where they are located in the continent, in order to be able to build a strong economy and that can emancipate the continent, irrespective of the place of origin. So that kind of union will allow Africans to settle anywhere, to work anywhere. Unfortunately, the Monrovia Group were those who cherished the power that they enjoy as a result of the partition of Africa into states. So they prefer to sustain independence, sovereignty, and national boundaries of the new states. So Tafawa Balewa argued in response to the advocacy of the Casablanca Group that sovereignty of each state must be respected, that states should be allowed to control their resources, that it is only when the states have been able to establish strong political system and thriving economy, that they can all come together and build an integration that will still continue to respect the boundaries of the new states. So unfortunately, most states share the view of the Monrovia Group. So as a result of that, Organization of African Unity was founded in Ethiopia in 1963 along the philosophical principle laid down by the Monrovia Group. So they agree that there was no need for a continental-wide integration. So though defeated, Kwame Nkrumah did not give up. He continued to believe that the only way that Africa can emancipate itself and be relevant and be able to compete with Europe, Asia, and North America, and Latin America, is for Africa to be united. So OAU had two clauses in its Article 3. One is that all sovereignties, all national sovereignties must be respected. And the second one is that Africa as a continent or any other country within Africa should not interfere with the domestic affair of other countries, even if the domestic affair threatens the sovereignty of other countries. So what followed that was that between 1963 and late 1980s, there were wars. Even Nigeria, the leader of the Monrovia group, experienced civil war that lasted 3 years, and there was about 3 million lives lost, especially in the eastern region of Nigeria, because of the eastern region of Nigeria's attempt to secede from the country because of bad governance under military administration. Africa also witnessed more military coup d'etat than any other continent. As a result of this, the military, who are not well equipped to govern states, squandered all the resources of Africa and rendered Africa to a mere resource supply base for Europe and United States. So for Africa to survive, Africa depended on the Bretton Woods institutions, aids and loans for quite a very long time. So the high debt ratio to African resources and per capita GDP rendered Africa the poorest continent in the world. By the late 1980s, the West Africa decided to abandon the principle of Organization of African Unity when it became reality that the entire region might be wiped away and most of the citizens of the countries of West African region might be displaced as a result of wars in most of the countries constituting West African community. So the West Africa decided to establish an international response force called ECOMOG for them to be able to intervene in violence in other countries to help sister countries. So ECOMOG proved to be a very useful organization, sub-organization, when it helped to end the war in Liberia and Sierra Leone and prevented another outbreak of war in other West African countries, including Gambia, Togo, and Cote d'Ivoire. So the countries met again, the head of states and government met again in Monrovia and decided to reevaluate Organization of Africa's unity, possibility of leading them to a viable continent. So following the Monrovia group meeting, there was another meeting in Lagos where they decided that even if African countries are afraid of relinquishing some of their sovereignty for the continent's emancipation, they can start with regionalism. So first they founded African Economic Community, which they believe will unite all African economy by year 1999. So they met again in Abuja, where they agree that it is time for them to revisit the issue of United States of Africa, irrespective of whatever name they choose to call it. Then they met again in South Libya, where Muammar Gaddafi advised all other head of states that, look, it is time to abandon Organization of African Unity, because Organization of African Unity was just an organization where leaders met and made declarations. The organization cannot interfere in the problems, political problems and economic problems of African continent. So that wasn't the organization that will lead them to the 21st century economic emancipation that they desire. So there they agree that they should found another organization called African Union. So African Union was launched in year 2000, and all the 53 states at the time and 2 other territories signed on to the African Union Treaty. So the first and most important thing in the Article of African Union is that it's discarded the principle that Africa cannot interfere in the domestic affair of all other states, of any of its member states. So now African Union will be able to accomplish everything that was advocated by the first group of Pan-Africanists who advised that the only way forward for Africa, economically and politically, is to found the United States of Africa. Though the name is not United States of Africa, but the goal and its principles reflects what those people advocated in 1963. I applied three theories to discuss, to analyze this issue. The first is interactionalism, and second is functionalism and neoliberalism. The relevance of interactionalism is that African leaders at the time of founding OAU did not even understand what Organization of African Units should be like and the purpose it should serve. And as a result of that, they all have mixed expectations. Then functionalism suggests that African leaders fail from the beginning, because if you're founding an organization, a continental organization that you expect to help emancipate a continent, then you should see the entire, all the member states as bodies of a whole, which wasn't their perception at the time. Neoliberalism tells us that in order for competing states to all get absolute gain as opposed to relative gain, they must found a cooperation based on institutions where there are principles and there are enforcement mechanisms. So African Union has all the institutional prerequisites to achieve the goal of United States of Africa. Unfortunately, Africa still has a long way to go. But in terms of institutions, Africa is moving forward. The most recent of all the necessary institutions that Africa just founded is the ACTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area. Now, by the time AFTA comes to effect, all African businesses, people can go anywhere, establish business anywhere, irrespective of their place of origin. Now, there are many obstacles still, but the most debilitating obstacle is still nativism and protectionism. We see from time to time, in terms of the behavior of African leaders and their preparedness institutionally, that most African leaders, especially the largest countries and the richest countries like Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, still display xenophobia and still cherish their nationalism, and they're still protectionist in their behavior. So we're still lacking the political will that is needed for African Union to thrive. But it is remarkable to note that African Union has all the institutional structures needed for Africa to emancipate itself, for Africa to function like the European Union or United States of America. And we can understand that the Africans themselves realize that it is a long way for them and it is not going to be easy. So they gave themselves up to year 2063 for them to attain that status. So the only challenge now is the political will.
Victor, I'm sorry, I have to cut you off. I apologize, but I want to make sure we get to everyone. Thank you. So we'll make sure to come back in the question and answer section.
All right.
Pamela, next we have Pamela.
Yes, I'm going to try and share my screen, if that's okay.
Sure. So you should be able to. There you go.
Okay, so everyone can see that, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Pamela, and today I'll be presenting a paper I've written that's titled The Gendered Economics of Political Empowerment Lessons from Nigeria, Africa's Largest Economy. So the motivating, is this moving? There we go. No, that's not it. There we go. The motivating puzzle for this project is trying to understand one major question, also a sub-question. So the major question here is, why are women in Nigeria overrepresented in small and medium-sized enterprises, but somehow underrepresented in political engagement and political leadership? So I'm trying to understand, why is it the fact that women are very much engaged in economic life in Nigeria and even beyond across the continent, but not as much when it comes to political life in terms of grassroots engagement, but also in terms of political leadership, both at the national level and at the state level. And so in trying to understand this paradox, I'm trying to see how this might actually deviate from some of the dominant literature, political economy literature in particular, on gender and development more broadly, particularly given the fact that a lot of that dominant literature comes out of the South Asian context. There we go. And just to give you a bit of a visual of what this gender gap looks like, I use Afrobarometer survey data to kind of create like a composite index of political engagement using questions on people's voting patterns or people's engagement in community meetings, people's contact of different government officials, people's protest behavior, and other questions that speak to political engagement. And I created a composite index that was used to kind of get a general overview of a snapshot of political engagement and compared it across men and women in terms of what they reported as their political engagement. And there seems to be a gender gap across most countries. So Afrobarometer data is not across all 54 countries, but they do have data from about 34-ish countries. And so as you can see here, I have the Nigeria case sort of like highlighted in green. And so it's not the country with the largest gender gap, but it also isn't the country with the least either. So the gender gap is pretty wide in Nigeria. So it goes from a scale from 0 to 1. And on here, you can see for Nigeria, that gender gap in terms of overall political engagement reported in Afrobarometer is around 0.3. And then to break that down by the different components of this political engagement index, I also have here this figure that shows how being female or identifying as female versus male, how that kind of relates to different reported political engagement indices. So these could be things like I mentioned in terms of like voting, attending community meetings, contacting different leaders, whether that's religious leaders, traditional rulers, or even political bureaucrats, and attending campaign rallies, contacting the media, persuading others to vote, working for a candidate, protesting, being a civil society leader. And as you can see overall, generally being female is negatively correlated with being politically engaged. If anything, the index here where being female might be positively correlated with the report of being not engaged in politics. And so for even civil society leadership, we have like a little bit of a positive correlation there, but that's also very small. And so civil society leadership here refers to being a leader in a civil society, whether that's through a religious organization or community-based or cultural affinity group, as that's what that's referring to. So the only two cases here where being female is positively correlated with a form of political engagement is either in being a civil society leader or reporting as not being engaged in any of these indicators of political engagement. So that's to give like a general snapshot of what political engagement looks like in Nigeria, and also in the former slide regarding across the continent. And so we have this juxtaposed, okay, there we go. The slides are moving a little bit slowly. So I have this juxtaposed with women's engagement in economic life. And so I have here some data that shows women's engagement in entrepreneurship in particular. And so as you can see across different regions across the world, the highest reported rates of entrepreneurial activity take place in the sub-Saharan African context. And just like a little bit of a disclaimer, I don't particularly like the breakdown between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, but this is the best data I could find on entrepreneurship because generally the data on entrepreneurship is not that great. There's still a ways to go in that area. But in terms of the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor from the 2018-2019 period, the highest rates of entrepreneurship amongst women in particular are taking place in the sub-Saharan Africa region. I would have preferred more of a breakdown in terms of West Africa versus East Africa, Central Africa, South Africa, North Africa, but this is what we got. This is why I'm presenting this, to give you like a sense of what that looks like juxtaposed with political engagement. And so this is not just a contemporary sort of pattern, we also know this historically as well. And so here's a quote from Sims in 1985 saying that the African woman as entrepreneur, in her case, said the 20th century, but I'm putting it in this case of the 21st century, is not a 21st century phenomenon, but an aspect of reality that's deeply rooted in the history of African social, economic, and political structures. In Western Africa in particular, women as merchants and traders have become legendary. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the puzzle, I'm trying to understand why is it that we've seen women both contemporaneously and even historically very much involved and active when it comes to economic life, particularly when it comes to entrepreneurial and trade activities. But when it comes to political leadership, at least in terms of how we've sort of measured it in political science literature, we don't really see women being as represented as much as we might expect, given the link between politics and economics. So there are a vast number of factors that shape political behavior overall, and I decided to highlight a few of the ones here that shape women's political behavior in particular. And so I have socioeconomic power sort of like bolded here, because that's what I'll focus on in this talk and what I focus on in my paper in particular. But even beyond socioeconomic power and formal education, we also think of factors that are related to social cultural norms that tend to shape what is considered appropriate for women and men to do in different spaces, including in the political sphere, in terms of seeing the political sphere as a more so male dominated sort of sphere of society. And then other factors also relate to the nature of political institutions in terms of whether one is operating within a democracy with multi-party elections or not. And then political socialization in terms of whether one is even being exposed to the political process and even having some level of knowledge and competency regarding politics. And then of course, people's personal individual traits and values. And then gender quotas have also been seen across different spaces in different countries in terms of trying to increase women's political representation, and how that also does affect women's political engagement, even at the grassroots as well. So this is just me trying to give a highlight of the different factors that shape women's political behavior. But I decided to focus specifically on social and economic power in the paper itself. Okay, so in trying to understand how social and economic factors affect women's political participation, women's political behavior more broadly, I tried to understand what are the costs that people face when it comes to political participation. And so I'm pretty sure we're all kind of familiar with Brady et al.'s work on the resource model of political participation in terms of thinking of resources such as time, money, and civic skills as things that kind of shape people's political engagement generally, because engaging in politics or even learning about the political process does involve an investment of time, money, skills, knowledge, energy, and all these different resources just to even know about what's even going on and deciding to be part of the political process, whether that's within one's local community or even running for office. And so as I was trying to understand the costs that are associated with political participation, I also wanted to look at sort of like intersectional feminist models of the costs associated with political participation in terms of thinking about the risks that are involved in one expressing themselves politically, whether that's through either running for office or even voting, or even speaking up in a political sort of like community gathering. And so these costs that are associated with political participation usually involve a level of risk, especially if one is operating in a space or a system that is particularly patriarchal. And so these costs could include social costs or even backlash effects in the form of either physical, psychological, or semiotic violence. For instance, in terms of women even facing misogynistic either messaging or language whenever they do try to speak up or engage in the political process. So when I was thinking about how do social and economic factors sort of affect one's political behavior, I'm also thinking about what are the costs that one is even facing when they just do decide to engage in the political arena. Okay, so even beyond gender itself, as I was doing fieldwork in Nigeria in the year 2019, summer 2019, I was also talking to different people trying to understand how does class, particularly thinking about class in terms of like socioeconomic class, affect the kinds of politics people are involved in. And one of the interviews I had with somebody that was working at an organization that is focused on government accountability using technology, he had a very insightful way of trying to just like summarize sort of like the class differences when it comes to political behavior. And he had basically said that low income earners are politically active more so than those who are higher income earners. So he was saying that, but in this case, elites and upwardly mobile folks are not as politically active as those who identify as low income earners. And this is because the elites feel that there's very little they can do to either change or influence political decisions. The political parties have a way of having their way, and then the elites are pretty laid back. Low income earners know that if they actively participate, they can get 5,000 naira or a bag of rice given to them by political parties. Sorry, I have people's faces blocking my actual quote. So I'm trying to like move the screen around a little bit so I can see what I'm reading. Okay, there we go. They're easily lured by party handouts. This is why they're more active in politicking. And so I'm not sure if you're able to understand exactly what this direct quote is trying to say. And so here, so in this quote, what he's trying to say is that he's trying to make a distinction between politics and governance. So in the sense that people who are like low income earners or who have lower socioeconomic backgrounds or who might have more time on their hands are more likely to show up to register to vote, to actually vote, show up to campaign rallies, because they're more likely to be lured by these sort of like clientelistic appeals by presidential candidates or even gubernatorial candidates as well. Whereas those who are middle or upper class folks who don't really have the time and who are not easily lured by either money or bags of rice are less likely to engage in politics in this way. And so he was making a distinction between sort of like everyday electoral politics and other forms of politics, which might speak more so to government accountability. And so this actually brings me to my next point. And so as I try to figure out the gender gap, whether that's across different sort of like class backgrounds, I was thinking, is it really the case that women are not politically engaged in the ways we're thinking? Or is it that they're actually engaged and we're not just capturing it in conventional political science measures of political engagement? So even looking beyond electoral politics in terms of like voting and registering or even contacting electoral officials, as was seen in Afrobarometer data, are there other ways that women are showing up to be involved in the political process that's not really being captured in dominant political science literature? And so that's when I bring out the term infrapolitics or infrapolitical behavior, which was coined by James Scott when he was looking at everyday resistance by peasants in, I think it was in South Asia or Southeast Asia. And so the idea here is for me to sort of apply this idea of sort of like subversive forms of resistance that women are engaging in that might not be captured by our conventional measures. And some of these examples could be something as simple as talking through male kin who are involved in the political process, or even if one is at a meeting and they're not able to speak up, given the power dynamics of that meeting, they might hiss to indicate disagreement, or ululate to indicate agreement, or they might evocate like supernatural forces to engage in some sort of like a fight for power, or even spreading rumors or using songs or sitting on a man, which is like a common practice in Southeastern Nigeria in the past, or even using social media, using writing, using music, using other forms of political activism to also engage in the political process that we might not be capturing in our sort of like large scale survey data. So that's what I was trying to get at here when I was talking about infrapolitical behavior. So even though we do see this gender gap in political engagement, what I'm trying to pull out in the paper by looking through different African feminist lens is to show that actually, yes, there is a gender gap when we measure political engagement in a particular way, but that doesn't mean that women are not engaged, just engaged in other things. And social and economic forces are what is shaping their engagement in these other spaces. So the key takeaways from the paper, there's actually a lot in the paper, but I wanted to make sure this fits within 15 minutes. So the key takeaways that I have is that, one, the presence of politically enabling social networks and economic power are important for political behavior. And so when I was speaking towards social power and economic power, what I'm referring to is not just access to economic resources, but also access to people who are in the political process. Are you part of either a network or part of a family or part of like friendship groups, or do you have colleagues who are involved in the political process? And how does this actually matter for your political behavior? And so the presence of these politically enabling social networks coupled with economic power matters for shaping people's political behavior, where that behavior shows up in terms of the formalized ways of political engagement, or the more so informal or more infrapolitical forms of engagement. Having people in your network who are involved in politics also matters for shaping political behavior beyond just having time or money or the typical resources. And then another key takeaway is that we need an intersectional assessment of the costs that are associated with political participation in order to better analyze the gendered variations in political engagement, because the costs are not just limited to resources, but they also include costs related to risk, the risk of even being visible in a space that's historically or even contemporaneously patriarchal. And so similarly, in order to develop a more nuanced account of political behavior in Africa, we need to examine these contextually relevant and diverse forms of political behavior, which is what I was speaking towards when I was talking about the infrapolitical forms of behavior and giving some examples. So I think I'll end it there in the interest of time, but thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Pamela. So now we will turn it over to Maribel for the discussant to offer comments to the panelists based on their papers.
Thank you so much for your papers. I very much enjoyed reading them. So as far as a bit of background where I'm coming from, I am a historian of elite US philanthropy and the social sciences. So basically, my book is coming out in October, and I situate a central text of the US civil rights movement as part and parcel of efforts by a foundation to facilitate social scientific knowledge to white policymakers across the Anglo-American world in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in colonial Africa. So I'm also founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences. I encourage you guys to check it out. It's an effort to center the scientific output of global majority scholars throughout the global South and North, and for us to come together to discuss knowledge production in our fields. Hold on a second. Sorry, there's some noise at where I am. I apologize for that. Let me move. This is a bit better. We'll see. We'll play it by ear. So I wanted to start off with Saida's paper. And first of all, I love the topic. I find it really fascinating. The paper title is called "How Relevant is Black Nationalism and Pan-Africanism in the 21st Century?" And these are some questions I had in the process of reading it. So according to the paper, is the noise making a lot of bothersome? Can you hear it? No, you're okay? Okay, so it's only me. That's good. It's only in my head. This works out. Okay, good. All right, so my question is, how do you define Black nationalism? Because at some levels, it is as broad as Black consciousness, but sometimes it's as narrow as a return to Africa. So what makes Booker T. Washington, for example, and Marcus Garvey both Black nationalists? And if the definition is a rising Black consciousness, is it perhaps also relevant to note which type has been and remains most threatening to white supremacy? In this vein, Booker T. Washington was not very threatening to key actors of white supremacy in the US. In many ways, his educational model was exported to very many parts of British Africa. So that was a form of separatism, if not a return to Africa, like a form of separatism within Black nationalism that was comfortable to existing norms of white supremacy and anti-Black subordination, which was different for Marcus Garvey. My own historical subjects were very fearful, and my historical actors being white foundation leaders in the US were very fearful of the Black nationalism of Marcus Garvey to the point where they mobilized to fund social scientific knowledge to help white policymakers suppress Black consciousness, a type of Garvey, but very comfortable with the form of Booker T. Washington. So maybe I would have wanted to read a bit about why I should consider them both within the same category, seeing that they had different positionalities with white supremacy. And then also a second question would be, why distinguish Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism if they're both, at least in your definition, both efforts to increase Black consciousness? What's at stake in distinguishing the two in the paper? So I would have enjoyed reading a bit more about that. What's at stake in distinguishing the two terms? Third, I think the paper is really neat in thinking about a world beyond the present. There's a lot of talks right now about just what world do we want to live in beyond neoliberalism. But maybe, at least I read in the paper, and you tell me if it's a bad reading, but it's not just that we're in this place because of the failures of rising Black consciousness or the failures of Black nationalism or Pan-Africanism. Maybe the problem has been its very suppression, that it hasn't been able, its inability in a white world order to realize its potential as a vehicle towards a more equitable, sustainable international community. So maybe the problem is its suppression itself of Black nationalism. And then lastly, I was really curious to read how you would relate your work to that of Adam Getachew, Keisha Blaine, and Cedric Robinson, for example, whose work blends the history of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, and also places Black nationalism within an internationalist vision. So I would have loved to read that too, how you situate them.
Thank you for these questions. I don't know if you want to go to everyone else or you want me to respond.
Yes, we could go through all of the panelists first and then respond.
Okay.
Okay. And then Victor, thank you for your paper. Again, I love the topic. The title is Real African Union, Political Stability and Economic Growth, the Prospect and Impediments. So these are my questions. I'm going to quote you. Don't you love being quoted? Everyone does. I hope you stand by every single word. Okay, quote, in this paper, an attempt has been made to determine whether African integration effort under the African Union can facilitate political stability and collective economic growth for the continent and its people. Unfortunately, however, by the second decade, OAU members and observers have legitimately described the OAU as a failed organization because of its inability to respond to intra-African crises and to defend the continent against foreign forces. In fact, the organization had little to show for its inaugural objectives. Therefore, members and observers clamored for reform of the organization. My question from that quote is, to what extent is it the responsibility of the OAU or the AU to avoid conflict, to maintain political stability or peace, and collective economic integration on the continent? A basic question, but I think we should pose it. Are these impossible metrics from which to judge the value added of an OAU or AU? After all, has the US government in the US achieved this, or the EU in Europe? Shall we judge the value of regional organizations not simply by their formation, that's already a feat, but also their relative success in economic, political, cultural, and social integration? Because from that perspective, the EU is a failure, and arguably so the US as a project. My second question is in section 4, the prospects, challenges of continental integration, section 4 in your paper, you write, quote, there are abundant evidence to extrapolate that political instability accounts partly for the Africa's wallowing economic debacle since the 1980s. It was not long after the launching of the OAU that coup, counter-coup, political assassinations, rebellion, and civil war started destabilizing many African countries. The catastrophic effects of these internal crises had domino effects on economic growth across the continent. Therefore, promoting democratization and the monitoring each other enshrined in Article 3 of AU are significant. Africa is beginning to demonstrate commitments to that objective, and there is no doubt that an increase in political stability would encourage economic growth, end quote. So in your paper, I don't see a lot of mention of the role played by international NGOs, World Bank, IMF, the UN, the US, the global North generally, in sustaining and encouraging economic and political instability on the continent. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Can the AU ever achieve economic and political stability for the continent if the rest of the world, the global North, isn't equally or sincerely invested in it as a first priority? And then my third question, I'll quote you here again. Despite the signing and ratification of the Treaty for Vision 2063, African states need to start demonstrating the political will to build a politically stable and economically prosperous union like the European Union, EU, end quote. With the mention of the EU, are we internalizing too much the global North's complementary views of itself as a metric of excellence and their own assumptions about self-inflicted failures in the global South by the global South? If so, why? Okay, and then my last comments for Pamela's paper, which I really, really enjoyed. And by the way, I love the section on the historical foundations of women's political and economic disempowerment in Nigeria with Igbo and Yoruba. That was really cool. Okay, so my first question for you would be about audience. So you're a graduate student doing your PhD at Harvard, and right? Okay. and that's always a moment when you're a doctoral student, at least when I was too, figuring out for whom am I writing, right? So to whom are you explaining the economic and political behavior of Kenyan women? And for what purpose? So it's helpful to just clear up who our audience is. Sometimes many of us sit between communities, and it helps to clarify for our own sense of our footnotes for the kind of argument we were trying to make with the data, whom we're writing to. And I even noticed that when you're speaking, you mentioned with the data on sub-Saharan and Northern Africa that you wouldn't be comfortable with those categorizations. We said this is the best we've got. So one, who's the we? And then why should you be okay using that data? Okay, then my second question is, in the essay you examined, quote, the paradox of Nigerian women's seeming presence in the economic sphere, but absence in the political arena, end quote. Here I'm gonna get into the nitty gritty of definitions. I just need some, and this is like long-term, just getting clarity. So which definitions of the economic sphere and political arena do you embrace? So for the economic sphere, I was reading your inclusion of small and medium businesses. But then it seemed that at different parts of the paper, you were critical about women's decreased involvement in, quote, innovation or passion-driven entrepreneurship. So for me as a reader, trying to make sense of, okay, what kind of involvement, what kind of economic involvement is Pamela celebrating, and which one is she just assuming is a norm or not relevant for her analysis? For the political arena, you include grassroots, but then you're critical, it seems, at least as when I'm reading it, critical about women's decreased participation in official posts. So then I wonder, are we looking at the decreased presence in political versus economic realm, or just varying forms in both? If we look across class lines, maybe it looks different. Are we looking at less affluent women who are more robustly active in both? Since, if you mentioned this in your talk right now, they are active, if not in political governance and innovation or passion-driven entrepreneurship, they are active in politics and quote unquote necessity-driven entrepreneurship. So could this be a story about less affluent Kenyan women's Nigerian, so sorry, did I mention, sorry, it's Nigeria. Sorry, I apologize. Sorry, no, that's my. So could this be a story about less affluent Nigerian women's greater economic and political participation versus more affluent women's own? But then you also mentioned decreasing barriers for top-down political engagement, which presumably would privilege access to more affluent Nigerian women rather than less affluent Nigerian women. So how is this not increasing more Nigerian women's participation? So depending on the class, so if they're less affluent, it seems like, at least from the data you're presenting in the article, that less affluent are actually participating in politics and then also engaged in small and medium businesses. So what is, I guess, if you can help me understand what kind of behavior you want to celebrate in the economic and the political in your analysis of Nigerian women. All right, and then lastly, what about the present day role of international NGOs? There are less, so I'm reading this, and again, I'm coming in from the perspective of someone who studies these elite US foundations. You write that there are less barriers to top-down political engagement and more women directing or working in small and medium businesses. And you mentioned the legacy of colonialism and subsequently independence. But how much of this too are the effects of international NGOs and foundations? Is part of the reason that there's more economic versus political power, political like governance participation? Is part of it at least that the global north micro lenders have preferred lending to women? Is there the type of leadership that some of these NGOs have been much more supportive of? So I would just be curious to see the role played by these organizations. And please accept my apologies. I am sorry that I messed up Nigeria.
Thank you so much, Maribel. So if you could each take about 3 minutes to respond, that'll keep us on track. If we go over, I must say I'll have to go because I have another panel to moderate. So if we could start with Saida, take about 3 minutes to respond.
Thank you, Maribel, for your comments. And so to answer your first one about the definition of Black nationalism, and so the definition that I'm using is just this rise in consciousness that people of the same phenotype were discriminated against simply because of their race. And so it's less about how their movement affects white supremacy and white supremacists, or whether it's a threat to white supremacy or white supremacists, but just this realization that because we share the same skin color, these things are happening to us. And so that's the definition that I hopefully focused on when it comes to Black nationalism. And what it is just this rising consciousness that the ills of society and our place in the United States and slavery and Jim Crow and some of these other things that have plagued the African-American community is simply because of one's skin color and their skin color or our skin color. Secondly, I think you asked, why should I distinguish between Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism? The reason why I distinguish both of these movements is because Black nationalism was in response to a denial of civil rights in the United States based on one's based on one's skin color and their phenotype again. Whereas Pan-Africanism was advocating for liberation from these colonial powers and independence, or re-independence, like I like to say. And so the reason why I distinguish between Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism, although both advocate for emancipation, Black nationalism solely was focusing on the plight of African Americans in terms of slavery, Jim Crow, lynchings, the denial of civil rights and civil liberties in America, whereas Pan-Africanism at its inception was focused on liberating these countries from colonial rule. And so that's why I distinguish between the two. And I think the third point that you raised, or the question that you had, was that the problems of these movements were because of the suppression of the movements. And so the reason why there's been a failure to launch or to be sustainable, I would argue, is because the suppression of both movements have lacked a diversity of allies. And so it can't always be African Americans fighting for civil rights. They need allies. They need other people who look differently from them to also support them in these efforts. Because as we've seen, African Americans have been complaining about a lot of these ills in society for a significant amount of time, and that doesn't necessarily move the mark. It has, and you've had people in Congress who were able to pass a Civil Rights Act and legislation who looked very different from the people who were fighting for it. But I think as you diversify and grow your ally base, then that would help move the movement forward in order to maintain its sustainability and its advancements, excuse me. And I'll stop there, and hopefully that answers your questions.
Thank you, Sarita. Victor.
Okay. You asked me 3 questions. To the first question about the extent to which OAU and AU can help prevent violence, if I got the question right. So I believe that the vision of the founding father of OAU, the most notable one among them, Kwame Nkrumah, was to establish a United States of Africa. And one of the most important goals that Kwame Nkrumah expects OAU to achieve is to have a strong military that can protect all of the African continent. In addition to integrating all African, independent African states to emancipate them economically. So if we look at the 2 examples of regional communities that successfully help prevent or mitigate violence, the 2 examples are ECOWAS with ECOMOG and IGAD, created by the East African community. ECOWAS was able to help end the war in Liberia and Sierra Leone. We know that without the intervention of ECOWAS, the entire West African community may have suffered from the war in Liberia and Sierra Leone. The same thing with the successful intervention of IGAD in the East Africa in Sudan that helped create the state of South Sudan. So I believe that, yes, it is the goal they set for themselves, but they kind of way away from that goal at the time of creation of the organization. But for African Union, I believe African Union was specifically interested in getting rid of those 2 clauses that prevent Africa from intervening, the Union from intervening. Now, on the second question, yes, it is true that the international organization, especially the Bretton Woods institutions, have participated in helping to resolve some of African economic problem. But the aftermath of the intervention of Bretton Woods institution has been negative, with the experience of many African countries on the introduction of structural adjustment program. And of course, we see that they are still highly indebted. And in fact, IMF categorized most of these African countries as highly indebted poor countries as recent as 2017. So That's the reason why Moyo from Zambia in writing stated and argued that foreign aid is not helping, that Africa should look inward. And finally, if I can, yes, it seems that we are relying more, we're
Sorry,
relying more
Victor.
on the model of.
I'm sorry, I have to, yes, that's 3 minutes. So we want to make sure Pamela has time to talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your feedback, Maribel. I really appreciate your questions. In the interest of time, I'll probably address just a few of them in the moment. And so I'll start off by saying that this paper, this project is part of a larger project, which is my dissertation project, which I guess is like the case for most of us graduate students. And so the larger project is looking at women's empowerment in business and politics and looking at that link. So within this, even with the global entrepreneurship monitor data I had presented, and you'd ask why am I okay using that data, given that I would even make those sort of like regional choices that they did make. And for me, it was more so using as a starting point to figure out, okay, what is available to begin with? And what is available entrepreneurship in particular is not that great, particularly across countries and across regions. So that's my starting point. But then that being said, I'm collaborating with the Center for African Studies at my school right now, working on a project where we're actually collecting survey data on sort of men and women's experiences in the entrepreneurial ecosystem across the continent. So when we're so specifically focusing on Nigeria, Kenya, and Ethiopia at the moment, but possibly broadening that out. So this is more like a starting point, but I actually do have like side projects that are looking at this with more robust data. And so even beyond that, with the Afrobarometer data, for instance, as was kind of alluded to in my project, there's some limitations in terms of how they define or even measure political engagement in different spaces, but I still use that to give like a general sort of like overall broad picture of what does this look like a snapshot within Nigeria in particular, but across the continent to get a sense of like, okay, are these trends going across borders as well? And so even within that, I'm still creating like my own original survey data to collect data on these other sort of like infra-political forms of behavior. I was supposed to be doing field work this year to kind of do like some participant observation and parse those things out. Because of the pandemic, I had to like switch gears, and now I'm doing like an online survey to kind of gather some of that and still doing some travel this summer, God willing. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that I'm using what I have and what is available. And even as I'm using those things, I'm being very critical of understanding what are the loopholes, where are the gaps, and how can I kind of like fill those gaps. So for me, these things are sort of like an entry point. Even with the small and medium enterprises, it's sort of like an entry point for understanding these questions about empowerment in business and politics. But I also want to consider even women who are involved in multinational, larger corporations too. So I hope that kind of gets at some of the questions. A lot more, but like I think my 3 minutes is up. That's what I thought. Okay.
Thank you. Well, I was trying to allot for like an extra couple of seconds since you started just a little late, but thank you for being mindful. So thank you all for those amazing presentations and wonderful papers based on Maribel's comments. I'd like to applaud you all. You all are more than welcome to stay on and continue the conversation. I believe, as I said, I have another panel to moderate, but I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference and that you stay safe and continue to do great work. Take care.
Pamela, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Yeah, I found this very interesting. I find the entire panel very interesting, but I find it very interesting that one of your findings is gender appears to be related to participation in civil society organizations, but not related to political participation. You know, it's kind of interesting because it suggests a disconnect between participation in civil society and political participation, which again goes against a lot of the literature that has existed about the importance of civil society. Now, I find it interesting because there is increasing questioning of that connection between civil society participation and political participation. But given your approach, how would you explain this disconnect? Because I thought it was quite striking that women are involved in civil society organizations in Nigeria, but they are not involved in political participation. How would you explain that? Would you use the same framework to explain that?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. So the thing here, I think there's an assumption being made that we tend to have that sort of like informal or civil society engagement must sort of like translate into sort of like broader formal political participation, which is what we would expect. But I think the puzzle here is trying to figure out why is that not the case here. And so I think part of the answer in that is trying to understand what are the power dynamics in civil society that might differ within formal sort of like politicking to an extent. And so also within that question is also the question of what kind of civil society engagement is that? So the data I was presenting there from Afrobarometer is very limited in that the way I kind of lumped it together as civil society was really women who reported being heads of churches and mosques and certain religious organizations and some cultural affinity groups, but didn't even really go beyond that. Like I wanted to capture like women who are leaders of like market associations, for instance, where in Nigeria in particular, that tends to have like a lot more power when it comes to sort of like formal politics, but that's the limitation of the data. So I think within that, there's a question of how are we defining these terms? And also beyond that, what are the power dynamics in sort of like formal national politics